Hey everyone, I'm Alex Neuman and this is Vida Digital. Usually we come to you in Spanish, but today, once again, we're having the chance to talk to somebody from the retro community. Like I mentioned before the interview, he's one of my top three favorite Brian Cox in the world. In this case, we mentioned the character actor and the physicist, but Brian P. Cox is from FV Research. That's FutureVision Research. And he's been pretty influential in a lot of people's lives through the devices that he makes available to the retro community. In this case, the FujiNet, which is one of the many things you can get on their website, and one device that I've been able to use myself on some of my retro computers and had a lot of success bringing all of these devices back and enjoying them once more like we did when we were little. What FujiNet is, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, it's a network adapter that connects your classic microcomputers to the internet and provides things like virtual disks, which is also great. So we're going to learn a little bit more about Brian's background, what inspired him to help the retro community, and where FujiNet might be headed. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start with just a basic question. What was your first computer, and how did that early experience spark your interest in building solutions for what is now a thriving retro community?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I'm excited to be here. And yeah, so my first computer experience would be an Apple IIe and a TRS-80 in junior high. But my first home computer was an Atari 1200 XL. And from the time I had that first computer experience, I was hooked. In fact, I was recently asking my parents about their memories of me getting started with computers. And they shared that when I had my first computer class, my outlook on school changed. So I knew from then I wanted to do something with computers. And from that first beginning in a basic programming class with a little bit of logo there in junior high, I went on into high school and took some basic classes and ended up in one of the first English classes with a dozen Apple IIe's for word processing and actually became a teacher's aide for that English teacher because she was thrown to the wolves with no computer experience expected to teach this. And that is actually what ended up happening is from that young age, not only did I know I enjoyed computers, but I found I had a knack for teaching others how to use and understand them as well. And
You know,
yeah.
I was going to mention that's really interesting because it echoes a lot of a part of my life in that regard, and part of the lives of people that I've interviewed so far regarding, and people that work with me in computers nowadays that are kind of in the same age range. There was a lot of that, helping the teachers work with computers that they were just, given without much warning or training or anything
Yes.
like that. And a lot of us began with either Apple IIs or Atari 8-bits, and in some cases, PETs or TRS-80 machines and things like that. So I'm really familiar with the feeling. Now, you mentioned basic, you mentioned programming and so on. It was kind of easier back then to ease into programming. You mentioned logo as well than it might be today with things like C and Python and all of that. How do you feel the landscape has changed both in how many more tools we have available for creating things versus then, but compared to like the learning curve?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to think about. And I actually feel that in, let's say, the last decade, we have moved from in a bell curve. It started, seemed easier in the 80s with those home computers to get into coding. And then what I discovered moving into the 90s as I went into college, then it was PCs. And it was difficult, more difficult to know what was going on under the hood of the computer. And then those languages became more high level, it felt. We went into the C and Pascal and uh, and then into more complex languages from there. But then the Raspberry Pis came out and the Arduino Unos and that whole family. And I'm finding now, as I actually do teach coding to middle schoolers as well, I'm finding that they are not only because they were practically born with a smartphone in their hands, so technology is nothing new, but we've moved back into a simple computer with very straightforward languages, perhaps Scratch, where you can drag and drop blocks to code, or even into Python. I'm finding that it's becoming easier for people to learn how to code again, as long as they've got that foundation with these new resources that are available.
Now, one of the first projects that I had the chance to work with was a very simple ESP32 Wi-Fi modem. I probably bought around maybe $15 worth of parts and had to solder it like 15 times because I wasn't as familiar with soldering. I mean, I haven't done any soldering in so long. What gap did you see in the retro ecosystem that convinced you to spend all these years developing FujiNet instead of just making another Wi-Fi modem or something simple like that?
Yes, a good question. And so what I first heard about FujiNets when they came out, of course, starting with the Atari
Hmm.
8-bit FujiNet.
Hmm.
And I purchased one from an online vendor
Hmm.
and was intrigued and was having a fun bout of nostalgia reconnecting. Um, but what I noticed is that, by the way, I'm not technically in the development, but more on the hardware maker side.
Okay.
Although I have had the opportunity, our most recent is the RS-232 FujiNet,
Hmm.
which perhaps we could talk about. And I actually was able to help in a design change there. But what I found is that they were the FujiNet team, as I call them, all these volunteers were developing for other computer platforms, but we didn't necessarily see the makers providing the actual hardware. And so in 2024, I met Thomas Cherryholmes, one of the main movers and shakers with FujiNet, and I met him at Vintage Computer Fair SoCal in 2024. And he mentioned that they were looking for more builders. And by that time, I had already established FutureVision Research, both for providing electronic teaching resources and actually learned to solder kits. And a little side note, that is something I've noticed within the retro community. We'll have many who are very interested in the retro computers, but as you know, the hardware is failing more and more. And so whether it's building a new device or trying to repair the original equipment, soldering is something that was a little bit lacking as a skill. And so I actually had developed a series of learn to solder kits that build up in skill levels to not only help the retro community, but help new people, new or young students who are just learning how to work with electronics. But at that time, when I met Thomas Cherryholmes in person, I found out that they were looking for makers. And more specifically, I discovered that they had a very mature FujiNet for Apple II and III. And the only place it was available at the time to purchase was through Moswald.com, who was the main hardware engineer on the team. And he was out of stock. So I saw an opportunity to hop in there and then start building them myself because I already had that skill set, not only for the soldering, but then working with circuit board manufacturers. For instance, one more thing I'll mention with this. Each of the electronic platforms for the different FujiNet devices have different hardware levels in them. For instance, the FujiNet for Coleco ADAM is primarily through-hole parts with an ESP32 development board attached. Meanwhile, the Atari and Apple Fuji nets are primarily surface mount parts, and they are tiny and a whole other adventure to solder by hand. So I work with vendors to assemble those PC boards, and then I do the pins themselves. One of the interesting things with each of the FujiNet platform devices is interfacing with the old computers when the connectors don't exist anymore. So we have to 3D print parts and hand solder things like that.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is that, for example, Getting things like DB19 connectors or the SIO
Oh,
port
yes.
connectors and so on is really difficult nowadays. Do you see a big enough demand from the retro community going forward so that maybe someone will pick up that mantle and maybe recreate some of those connectors in a sturdier way than what is being done in some cases with like pin headers and such?
Yes, I actually am seeing that. In fact, there's one company called Big Mess O Wires,
Hmm.
and he actually developed a DB19 connector, if memory serves. But he has an essay on his website of the ordeal it he went through in order to go through that process. And now he has what pallets full of them because when you go through manufacturing, right, you're talking thousands, if not millions, of components. So while I think there are those of us in the retro community, I would be very happy to be able to order up that connector. In the numbers that we are working with, it's just not cost effective most of the time to develop it. But fortunately, with the plastics that are available to us now with 3D printing and the fact that we have various pins that are still commercially available, it's not too difficult to have a reliable permanent connector. It just takes a little bit more of handiwork to get there.
Now, you mentioned several different kinds of implementations that are available of the FujiNet devices. Which one's your favorite and why?
Well, I would have to say the Atari FujiNet would be my favorite because the Atari is my favorite computer. Even though, as I've learning more of the history, the Atari 1200 XL was short-lived in the family of the Atari 8 bits, and some consider, we don't want to start a controversy, right? But some consider a little incompatible in some arenas. That is still the one that holds a near and dear place in my heart when it comes to the 8 bits. So that's really got to be my favorite. But I tell you that I find, as we might consider modern Apple computers, you might describe their design as an elegance. Whether you're talking an iPod or iPhone, there's an elegance to design. I find the same with the Apple II. It's more sleek and streamlined in its appearance, the case as well, I really like. So if you're asking me device, it's Atari. If it's the design or form factor, it's the Apple FujiNet.
You also mentioned that there are different hardware levels in different platforms. Can you explain what the differences might be and how one, for example, doesn't translate well enough to another or vice versa?
So in terms of the design that took place with the different FujiNet devices,
Yeah.
so one of the amazing things to consider is the immense size and international nature of the FujiNet development team. You, me, the audience can go to the FujiNet Discord or to the volunteer wanted page on the FujiNet and start developing hardware, software, testing, etc. So because of the device, let me say the diverse nature of the participants, we see a diverse range of hardware designs when a platform bring up occurs. So that's where I find a lot of the differences to be. While Moswald, I personally consider him, let's say, the supervisor of hardware design. That may not be true, but that's how I see him. That's how I think of him as a maker. I double check with him if I have a question on how something should be done. But we'll have certain let's take for instance the Coleco ADAM. Certain team members will get onto the Discord for that particular channel. And for any platform, they have what's called a bring up. That's where Moswald, Thomas Cherryholm say, we are doing this platform now, who's in? And then they make a basic hardware layout. And I think they also decide how many devices do they expect to make. Uh, could be part of the decision-making process. So when they developed the Coleco Atom, they started with through-hole parts, and they had a nice, reliable, stable means of doing so, and so they seemed to continue on with that. But with the Atari, Apple, and then even now too the RS-232 being the smallest form factor that is out, they've gone surface mount I think personally, because of the numbers we're expecting and I have seen, having surface mount allows you to introduce a level of automation in the manufacturing that could be a little more costly when you're dealing with through-hole parts. So that's kind of my thinking process, I think, on why we see this, what we do.
One of the ways that people are using retro computers is, for example, to get them online, to connect them through virtual serial Wi-Fi connections and so on to BBSs and things like that. That being said, the first thing that usually comes to mind when you think about the web and the internet and so on is things like HTTP or HTTPS or, having an IP stack and things like that. But most of the time when you're communicating data to the FujiNet devices and so on, you use a protocol called TNFS. Now, can you describe TNFS and how it works and why it might have been chosen for these devices, so that people understand a little bit more how these devices actually get the information they need to emulate things like disk drives and so on.
Certainly, right. So TNFS, we could think of it as a simple network protocol for transferring files. And that's the aspect where the FujiNet uses that team. The ESP32, which is really the brain of any given FujiNet device, is also doing, as you mentioned, it is processing HTTP. It even has a JavaScript parser, for instance, and those things. So it is processing many different protocols. But as I understand it, because of Thomas Cherryholm's work that he has done on other platforms and his skill set, really, he is a genius in helping one disparate computer system or talk to another. He came across the TNFS protocol as a nice, straightforward way to copy actual physical files, let's say, from one location to another. And because we have TNFS servers available, in other words, an application that can run on a regular Windows computer, Linux computer, then that allows us to provide all of the ROMs that we have saved on our hard drives to make them available for the FujiNet to read. And that's just on the local network over Wi-Fi with the FujiNet. But that same protocol also allows us to have TNFS servers anywhere on the planet with internet connections. And in fact, when you go to fujinet.online, they have a list of the servers that are available and if they're online or not at the moment, because these are also volunteers making them available. So that what that allows you to do is from your FujiNet menu, you can tell the device, I would like to mount an image, let's say for Jumpman Jr. You can mount it over a TNFS server wirelessly, and when your computer boots, it will load that file through TNFS and actually bring it into memory and execute it. And it never transferred the file, it literally read it bit by bit. So coming back again, circling to your question, that protocol TNFS allows us to have a universal method of transferring files between devices. And that's part of what's so amazing with FujiNet. You're not just getting an interface. You asked me earlier, why not design your own? And there are different interface levels for various 8-bit platforms, let's say. But with FujiNet, you're also buying into or jumping into an ecosystem where an Atari can talk to an Apple, can talk to a Coleco ADAM, and even play games together. And then, of course, by having this standard file method, we can transfer files independent of the platform you're working with at the time.
Now, TNFS is designed for files. Do you see a future
Yes.
where it might be expanded upon to, for example, you mentioned things like inter-platform games and things like that, for these computers to talk to each other and maybe exchange information? I'm remembering things like, having Quake parties or Doom parties or whatever back
Yes.
when you would play using IPX and not even TCP/IP. Do you see something like that in the future for FujiNet as well?
Not only more depth in the future, but they actually have that now. Yes, with the Atari, for instance, and Apple is where I've seen it. They have basically what's called a lobby, and so you can go into that lobby and then find games that are active with others. The first one, it almost seems to be the hello world of games that have been written, is a five-card stud poker game. So right now, you could launch up your Atari 8-bit with a FujiNet and launch five card stud and play that game with somebody on an Apple 8-bit with the FujiNet as well. And because this is all open source, all the development tools and resources, if any of your people in your audience want to develop a game of their own, those are all available so that you could actually expand on that. So yes, it's happening now, and I think it'll be more in the future. By the way, I might wedge this in right here. You may be aware that the Computes Gazette magazine just experienced a reboot, and we just now have our third issue, which would be for September 2025. And Thomas Cherryholmes has a monthly column in FujiNet development. And one of his most recent this month's is all about Tandy computers. So he actually has an article on developing games for Tandy color computers, which we also have a FujiNet device for that. So lots of resources, and I expect that to grow more and more with that inter-platform connectivity.
Speaking of that, you mentioned earlier, and we can go in depth a little more in a little while, the FujiNet for RS-232, FujiNet for serial. Having had experience working with FujiNet devices on several platforms, what do you think are like the biggest challenges that they overcome in each of the different platforms, things like bus timing or availability of, signals to use to actually do the emulation, things like that, power tolerances and things like TTL logic or whatever. How do you see the challenges being overcome in each one from an electrical engineering point of view?
Yes, and I like how you phrased that question because I see a situation where depending on the platform of the vintage computer, it actually then introduces unique challenges that were not seen with the others. And so, for instance, with the Atari 8-bit and the Apple 8-bits, we were able to obtain power for our FujiNet right off the connection we were using. And so power ends up being one of those challenges because now we've moved to RS-232 and the 9-pin RS-232 does not provide power. So as in the iteration for version 1 we have, it actually requires a USB-C 5-volt connector on it to work. But I find that, as you mentioned, really it's that communication protocol that's unique for each device. For instance, when we have a bring up, which is Thomas Cherryholm's term for we're starting a new platform, then that's one of the first things they decide is how in the world are we going to communicate with this device? With the Apple 8-bits, they settled on the smart port, which allows an external floppy drive, for instance, among other things with an Apple. And a smart port will allow you to boot from an external floppy. So that gave us the ability to have an Apple computer, for instance, an Apple IIe, look to an external device connected by smart port and actually allow the FujiNet program to boot off of that device and then get into our configuration menu. With the RS-232 version, we have an interesting challenge. The level we're at right now with maturity, we do have version 1 for the platform, but right now we have a config sys driver, which, if you remember from the days as we started to grow in abilities, you had to have a mouse driver and then a CD-ROM driver. And now we have a FujiNet.sys driver. You have to get that onto your original PC, and then it will talk over the serial, and you can mount drive letters. We do not have the config menu as our other platforms do. For instance, on the Atari and Apple, really all the others I'm aware of that are considered production ready, when you power the computer, you get a FujiNet menu. It'll ask you what Wi-Fi you want to connect to, if any, and then it'll allow you to mount images or go to the game lobby. With the RS-232, so far what we have is we get drive letters, but I found that to be quite useful. So you can have an image mounted that gives you all the contents of a hard drive, for instance, being accessed through the FujiNet. But coming back to your hardware question, I do find that it's the interface that becomes one of the biggest challenges, and then connected to that is then what are your power requirements? And fortunately, now by the way, as we're moving into some more platforms, like they have a bring up for the Intellivision, they do have prototypes for, believe it or not, Atari 2600. Now we're moving on to a bus. And so if you think of it like a cartridge or a card bus, and that introduced new challenges because now we're working at speeds faster than the external connectors were expecting. And that brought in a redesign of the fundamental concept of the platforms. Really what it boils down to is you mentioned using ESP32, which is still the brain for FujiNet. But now they're branching into something like the Raspberry Pi RP2040, which has much faster pin speeds to allow that bus communication. So we're still in the card bus development level, but that's been the most recent challenge.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, maybe what the next step might be when you kind of outgrow the ESP32, being that, as with many other similar projects, they keep adding on functionality as the community, provides more ideas, and in some cases, more of an effort to actually code and design all of these additional functionalities. Um, I don't know if you remember, and this is back from the BBS days, the story of the stone soup.
I don't remember that.
I don't remember which BBS operator's manual had the stone soup story. It basically is this wizard type guy comes into a village and he takes this big cauldron, puts it in the middle of the square, and gets all full of water and whatever. And he takes out this bag, and in the bag there's a stone, and he plops it in the cauldron and starts stirring and says, this is going to be great. I'm going to have stone soup. Stone soup is really good, really delicious, really great for your nutrition. It's going to be great. I just wish maybe somebody had some vegetables or something, because stone soup with vegetables is even better. And somebody comes in and says, sir, I have some vegetables. Mind if we share the soup you make? The guy says, sure, pour them in. And they pour in, and he starts stirring. And he said, this would, really benefit from maybe a little meat, or maybe some chicken or something. Some guy comes in, hey, I have some chicken. Mind if we share the soup? Comes in and drops the chicken, and he starts stirring. Maybe some seasoning would also help. This would be great. And somebody says, I have some seasoning. And can I share? Sure, go ahead. Everybody in the village contributed. Everybody in the village ate and was full and was happy. And then the guy just took his stone, put it in the bag, and it was about to leave the village. And somebody said, hey, I'll buy the stone from you. This was great soup. And he said, I got the stone outside the village. It was just sitting next to the entrance to the village. You guys made the soup yourself. This is just my prop. So thanks and bye.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's kind of a stone soup effort where somebody comes in, says, I have this idea, I'm going to start this effort, and they get to like a basic product, but then people start contributing more and more. That's kind of the
Yes.
beauty of this whole ecosystem in that regard. In that sense, I've seen that there's FujiNet for, like you mentioned, coming up with the 2600 and other platforms. I've heard that there's one for one of the Sinclair models, the Spectrum as well.
They're working on one, yes,
Okay.
and they're just different levels of development. Hmm.
Okay, because I'd love to see one for the ZX81.
Yes.
I've seen there's a module called the Z Expand interface by
Mhm.
somebody, and I've had my eye on it. Haven't had the budget for it yet,
Right.
but it would be really interesting. And I'm really looking forward to all of these efforts, reviving these machines and getting them online and getting them to do things that they weren't necessarily designed to do. Now, in that regard, one of the great things that I enjoy about the FujiNet is you mentioned the user interface where you can do things like print to PDF or you can choose
Yes.
images and so on. In that regard, what do you think about room for improvement to make that user experience better regarding the user interface, slot managing, mounting images, TNFS catalogs, and so on? Where do you see room for improvement in FujiNet devices?
So that's an interesting question. I really feel that the fundamental interface we have now, I think because of the nature of the cross-platform unified appearance, then I'm pretty happy with the interface as it is. What I do see is that we need to advance it to the other platforms. For instance, we need to have that config screen for the RS-232 version. What I find too is that this isn't a recent addition, but one of the aspects I appreciate is that the interface that is available for your FujiNet can actually be accessed through a built-in web server on the ESP32. So from a quote unquote modern computer, we can open a browser, go to fujinet.local, and see all of those options as you mentioned for mounting drives, setting up print to PDF, things of that nature. So really what I would like to see more improvement, and it's going to require new blood to come in on new team members. We are always looking for more development help to improve or expand on the game lobby. We need really, for instance, more game developers or people who have a game idea for multiplayer that can come in and then build that in so we can incorporate it into the experience that we already have ready to go.
One of the great things about the ecosystem that we mentioned is how everybody cooperates and collaborates in different ways, from
Yes.
design to coding and so on. How do you collaborate, and how do you, for example, encourage people to collaborate with institutions like museums, retro shops, and so on to accelerate the support and the adoption of devices, not just like FujiNet, but other projects that do other things for the retro community?
Yes. Well, I'd say one definite way is to do interviews like this that I get to do with you today. Another is the vintage computer shows and other uh, retro shows that are available across the world. I will say that I do want to. I mentioned Thomas Cherry Holmes a few times, but I really find he is that great recruiter who is tireless in helping spread the word and gathering more people into the FujiNet flock. But one of my favorite ways to do it is really to make the hardware available so that developers can continue. So for instance, the FujiNet device we have for the Tandy Color Computer 1, 2, and 3 is still not technically in the version 1 production ready device. It is so very, very close. But what I found is that we didn't really have enough team members, I felt, working on expanding the development. So I went ahead and started building prototype devices so that we could get them out into the ecosystem so that we can have more people working on them. And it is frankly so ready that I consider it production ready. And I now have sold over 50 of the Tandy color computer cartridges, even though it's not technically version 1. But we have many happy customers out there. And that's what I find is a valuable part that I can contribute since I'm coming from a hardware standpoint is to help get the hardware out there because after all, the more people have that FujiNet on their computers, then the more can work on developing it and actually adding to the program.
Now, you mentioned something that is also pretty important for not just the retro community, but the computer enthusiasts in general, which is hardware availability. Fast forward 20 years from now, um, if retro then means M1 Max or Thunderbolt, do you see maybe a future FujiNet for Thunderbolt that could emulate things like docks or network
Mm.
cards or NVMe drives or things like that for machines that lost their original cloud backends or access to, updates and things like that.
I do see that. And what's amazing is because we have this foundational FujiNet platform in code, then they're actually able to even emulate the FujiNet environment inside modern computers. So I think that will continue. For instance, they have a FujiNet emulator that you can run on your PC. And Altira is one of the popular Atari 8-bit emulators that can run on a Windows computer, for instance. And you can actually bring in a FujiNet emulator on there. So you don't even have FujiNet hardware or an 8-bit Atari computer physically, but you can emulate the entire thing. So I think, yes, because of the infrastructure and foundation the FujiNet project has developed, even as hardware advances, and the ESP32 that we use is very long in the tooth, they, I believe, will be very ready to advance it to the hardware that's out in 20 years from now as well, whether it's hardware or emulation, I think.
Okay, let's talk a little bit less further in the future for now. What do you see in the roadmap for not just FujiNet, but its interaction with the rest of the retro community in general?
I think one is going to be adding more platforms to the environment. And while I would say for me personally, I keep my finger strongest on the pulse when it comes to hardware development, rather what are goals and plans. I have heard Thomas Cherryholm say that the hill he will die on is getting a FujiNet on every platform that exists. So I could say that that is one of the big plans in the future is to bring more in. And one of the reasons I think that that's so important is every time we expand to another platform, we now have a little niche, not little necessarily, a niche of people who may not pay any attention to Atari or Apple vintage computers, but we have someone who is a skilled coder who really enjoyed Intellivisions, let's say. And when that person finds out that there's a FujiNet for Intellivision, then that could spark their interest to develop into the ecosystem for us all to enjoy. So I really feel it is about helping as many different platforms understand that this is a possibility. And we see these vintage computer shows really growing, whether it's the official VCF or any others. And you see such a diverse gathering of people from all walks of life. And what I like with FujiNet is that is now allowing them to then connect virtually as we connect in person at these shows. And I think that's only going to increase and improve as we develop more.
Excellent. I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm definitely going to try and reach Terry as well because I'd really love to hear his take on, how the whole FujiNet thing got started and where it's going, and
Oh,
especially the
yes.
hardware part. And that's going to be really interesting. So I'm going to try and reach out to him as soon as I can. In the meantime,
Mhm.
I want to really thank you for your time talking to us about, how FujiNet is, doing all of this for all the users and, for all the people listening and watching on my social media, my YouTube and Spotify. Check out the FujiNet website. Check out the fvresearch.com website for more information as well. And I'm going to be looking into a lot of stuff on TNFS. And I know I have a
Yes.
Linux container running on my server and I've tested it and it works
Mhm.
well, but I want to be sure that it's safe to run. And I'm going to look at the security part and making it read only, making sure it's, legally hosting files before opening it
Oh, yes.
up to the internet. But in the meantime, I'm really enjoying, being able to use all of these computers without having to worry about floppies going bad and things like that, which is usually the case.
Oh,
Do
yes,
you
absolutely.
want to recommend to whoever's watching this video any resources that they might want to consult regarding either emulations like you mentioned with Altera or more information on the hardware and the efforts behind not just FujiNet, but every other interesting retro project out there?
Absolutely. I do want to mention when you mentioned looking for another person to interview, I
Mhm.
heard the name Terry, and I think you may have meant Thomas Cherry Holmes.
Thomas. Yes, Thomas.
And so
Thank you
yes, and
so much.
he is definitely will be a wonderful person to tap his knowledge
Mhm.
and insights on all of this.
Mhm.
And so I would say the top place to go for resources is
Mhm.
the FujiNet Discord.
Mhm.
Because you're not only going to find a channel for each platform that's in development,
Mhm.
channels for platforms that are pondering, and general discussion. So I find that to be a wonderful gathering of vintage aficionados,
Mhm.
whether in even if you don't have any desire at the moment, I don't understand why, but in FujiNet, that Discord is a wonderful place. Another very good resource I find would be some podcasts that are out. So, for instance, the Floppy Days podcast and the also the Antic Atari podcast, Retro Computing Roundtable. Those are all wonderful podcasts who also have a collection or a community that you can connect with and then dig more and more into the vintage computer world.
That's really interesting. I'm going to write all of that down as I do the transcript for this show, and I'm going to look at more information as well, see if I can join that Discord. It's really going to be
Excellent.
interesting to be, in the presence and to talk with all of these other retro enthusiasts. I'm also Googling information about VCF events, and there will be one in Latin
Yes.
America, from what I can tell. It
Oh,
says
very good.
April 2026 in Brazil. So I'm gonna look at that, see how that it's in Sao Paulo or something. I'm gonna check it out. And
Yes.
yeah, I'd love to have one here in Panama so I wouldn't have to travel because I like to travel, hate to fly. There's a difference, but yeah.
Ah, gotcha. Yes. Well, you could
Well,
always visit the Vintage Computer Federation and have a chat with them. They're very accommodating for those who would like to expand the outreach for these kinds of programs.
sounds like a plan. I'll give
Yeah.
that a try.
Awesome.
And if people want to, connect with you and maybe join any mailing lists you host or, visit your website, could you give us a tour of
Yes.
how they can
Yes.
get in
Thank you
touch?
for asking.
Hmm.
So my company name is FutureVision Research. So
Hmm.
you can do that.com
Hmm.
or easier, you can do FV Foxtrot Victor
Hmm.
Research.com. Once you're on my site, of course, you could use the contact us page if you'd like to reach me. But I do have a FujiNet Substack. And so that would be an email list where I help disseminate out news as I see important for anything in the FujiNet sphere, let's say. So you can also subscribe to that FujiNet Substack from my website.
Subscribing now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone, thank you for joining me with, here interviewing Brian Peacocks, and definitely I'm glad to have had this time to share with him and talk about FujiNet. Be sure to like and subscribe and all the stuff and the doobly-doo and so on. And I'll see you on my next interview with somebody else from the retro community. So I'm looking forward to that. Okay.